Okay, welcome. Welcome to this CREAF Talk. Let's okay, sorry. Let's start this CREAF Talk. It's truly a pleasure introducing you, Giuliano Locosselli. He's visiting Europe. He's mostly in Portugal for 3 weeks, and he took advantage of visiting Europe and has come here for 3 days. He's associate professor at the University of Sao Paulo. Also, he's a researcher at the Center of Nuclear Energy and Agriculture, which is a strange name, also at the University of Sao Paulo. And he has been working mostly on dendrochronology in the tropics, but most recently he has started working as well in urban trees, as well with ecosystem services and natural-based solutions. So the stage is yours. I would say that he's one of the most productive persons because just in a stay of 3 days, he managed to sample 100 trees in Barcelona, coming here, so that's super efficient. So the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot. Well, regarding the sampling, I had the best team together, so working together, I really appreciate all the efforts. So thank you very much. And thanks for having me here. Thanks, Laia, also for inviting me to give this talk and for all the support during the days. And I'm just checking here. Well, when I was planning this presentation, I decided to start from the end, and I'll give you really the take-home message of this presentation. And I really hope that you agree with me at the end of the presentation. And really, the take-home message here is that the sky is the limit. That's how I feel in terms of the dendrochronology. When I started back in the early 2000s, that was one of the things that motivated me most, because really I could see how dendrochronology and tree rings can be used for different subjects to answer different questions. And coming from a conference, tree ring conference last week, like Elia was there too, I think it's pretty much clear that really the sky is the limit, because there are so many applications in terms of dendrochronology. And I hope you agree, you share this opinion with me at the end of this presentation. So really the whole thing starts with the tree rings, right? This is a cross section of a species you are going to hear a lot in this presentation. That's the Tipuana-Tipu. You have several trees in the city. And well, for tree ring research, of course, you need the tree rings, and they need to be anatomically distinct. So these are concentric rings or concentric layers that we analyze, and we can identify them by changes in the wood anatomy. For instance, this is the tree ring of Tipuana-Tipu. And if we look here, we can see the pores. These pores are the vessels, and they change the size from the beginning all the way to the end. So they are wider in the beginning of the ring, and they become narrower in the end of the ring. If we isolate the vessels, it may become more clear to see how they are. And we call this a semi-ring porous wood. And also, if we look again here, it's not only the vessels that change, but also we can see that there is this thin white line here. This is a marginal parenchyma band. So we can see that this ring has not only changes in the vessel size, but also clear the limitations by the marginal parenchyma bands. Well, having clear tree rings is very important. I mean, probably here in Europe it's not really an issue, but coming from the tropics, where we have like thousands of tree species in the forest, we actually work with a handful of species, like 10, 12 species. They are really the ones that we actually can work with dendrochronology, or we do work with dendrochronology. I'm pretty much sure that we may find others in the future, but that's what we have so far. And it's different from Europe. I think here, most of the species, they have clear tree ring boundaries. Andy?
Sorry, just, yeah, I want to put this one. Only, but not there. I don't know how to put just the speaker.
I think
we are not seeing.
Yeah, that.
But Barba, now you are mute.
It's working, right?
Thank you, Tere.
Yes, perfect. Now perfect.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay. So not only, you don't need only to have clear tree rings, but these rings, they must also be annual. And now it's not working. Yeah. And also, I think this is not really an issue here in Europe, but in the tropics, that's a very important issue. Not every tree produces annual rings. So you can see here that we have several trees here. We are measuring in the city of São Paulo. Some show clear annual patterns of growth. Other ones, they don't really show. And we cannot work with rings that are not really annual. If the tree produces like 2 rings a year, or if produces made 1 ring every 2 or 3 years, we cannot use the dendrochronology for that. So it must be really annual. So we can use one of the techniques that we use to identify annual rings is using the 14C curve, the bone peak that we call. During the 50s and 60s, because of the nuclear experiments, of the bomb experiments, we changed the composition of 14C in the atmosphere, and we can track these in the tree rings, and we can use it to see if a single tree ring was produced in the year that we estimated was. So we can take like several samples in the woods, and we can plot it, the 14C that we measure in the bomb peak, and if it falls on the right places, we know that they are annual. But sometimes we actually measure the 14C, and then we plot them, and they are quite off. And this is the case for a study of Hu Brini and Jessica Baker. And well, they sampled Cedrela all over South America and Central America. And overall, in all the sites, the trees produce annual rings. But one site, that's in the Suriname. And we can see that for all the other sites, there is one clear dry season. But here, in the Suriname, we have a bimodal precipitation, and that's why these trees probably produce 2 rings instead of 1. So these are annual rings, clear annual rings, and here is the sample from the Suriname. These are real rings. This is a false ring because of the bimodal precipitation. So we have to be very careful while you're choosing the species, and also while you're choosing the places to sample the trees. Okay, and then, well, we need to read what's written in the tree rings, and for that we can measure various variables in the tree rings, like the width of the tree ring. Now, this is the most commonly used. There are other ones that I'm going to show across the presentation, but tree ring width is the main one that we use. And based on tree ring width, we have produced some very important results that are supporting decision making. Like, this is one of the most famous reconstruction or temperature reconstruction based mostly on tree ring width, and it's called the hockey stick graph. And this is the reason why. And this reconstruction was published in 1999. It was very controversial in the beginning. Many researchers tried to let's say, to see if it was really reliable or not. Some considered it was not. But then after a few years, was understood as very important record of temperature. And it was so important that it was used in the 3rd IPCC report assessment. So I think this is one of the great, let's say, result that was used for decision making. Now, that was based on a few chronologies, very long, but few chronologies. But once you have like a network of chronologies like this one, you can reconstruct not only the past variability in the climate, but also the spatial variability in the climate. And that's how the Drought Atlas, they were built. This is the American Drought Atlas, and we can see that based on all this network of tree rings, we can reconstruct the temporal and spatial variability in the drought in North America. And there is also a Drought Atlas for Europe, for South America, for Asia. And this is very important when we are talking about, for instance, water management. And I'm aware here that you are going through a serious drought in the city of Barcelona. So it's very important for decision making too. This is another example of how dendrochronology can support decision making. This is the logging in the Amazon forest. We have a system that's called sustainable logging in the forest. And this logging, it relies on two very important parameters. One is the minimum logging diameter, and the other is the cycle time. So it's very important that these parameters, they are based on real data and on trimming, on growth data. And this is a study by Johann Schongart, and he called this technique growth-oriented logging, so that the trees, they would be cut in the forest, and we would kept this, the stocks of wood in the future. So this work was so important that it became a state law in Brazil. And I think this is another example of how dendrochronology can be used for decision making. Like it can be used to date very precious instruments like the Stradivarius violin. This one, for instance, is worth like $15 million. So people try to create false violins to sell it at very high prices, and dendrochronology can be used to see if these instruments, they are really real or not. And we can, by using the trimming with it, we can date these instruments using reference chronologies. You have several very long chronologies here in Europe, and we can take a small piece of the instrument and analyze the trimmings and try to date it using these reference chronologies. Not only that, we can use this trimming series of the instruments to try also to know where the timber came from when they built the instruments. So that we can really evaluate the authenticity of these instruments. And this is really only possible because today we have a massive network of trimming studies in the whole world. We can see here in dark green, these are the data from the International Trimming Data Bank, and in light green, we can see some data from a survey we published a couple of years ago, and we have more or less in total like 5,000 trimming sites that were analyzed in the last decades. But there is a very important gap overall in terms of trimming research, and that's not really in the forest, but really in the cities. And it's not clear to me why is that, why we haven't studied the trees in the cities. Maybe because it's just a door, a step door from our houses. Maybe because it's more fun to go to the forest than really stay in the city. And I remember reading a book from Hans Weingruber, that's sort of the papa of dendrochronology. And there was a chapter on urban dendrochronology, a very short chapter. And I think he, right at the beginning, he said, well, urban dendrochronology shouldn't work because you have a lot of noise from other things influence the growth of the tree. But actually, I think these other things, they may be very interesting to analyze in terms of dendrochronology. And here is just to give you an idea of how urban dendrochronology lagged compared to dendrochronology in natural forests. Why we have like 5,000 sites in natural areas, we have like 235 sites in cities. Although it's really small, what we have in terms of urban dendrochronology, I can tell that, well, at least it has a good representation in terms of climate and also in terms of demography. Here we have like the climate of 150,000 cities in the whole world, and we can see here in orange the distribution of the sites where they sampled the urban trees, and it has a good representation in terms of climate and also in terms of demography. So it's overall showing that urban dendrochronology should work very well. And while analyzing the whole literature in terms of urban dendrochronology, we're able to divide these or group these studies in 4 categories, I would say. Some studies, they are mostly evaluating climate risk. Others are more interested in cultural heritage. Others are assessing environmental pollution. And some of them are more focused on tree management. But overall, I would say that most of the studies on urban endocrinology, they focus on environmental pollution, while other ones they mainly focus on tree management. Let's talk a little bit about climate risk in the city. How can we use urban endocrinology to assess climate risk? And instead of using tree width, that's the parameters that I showed before, we are going to talk more about delta 18O, that's the oxygen isotopes. And one thing that's really nice about the oxygen isotopes is that the precipitation has a clear signature in the oxygen isotope. This is the precipitation of the city of São Paulo, and here is the signature of the delta 18O in the city. And we can see that there is a strong effect of the amount of precipitation in the delta 18O. So if it rains more, the delta 18O values are lower, and if it rains less, the delta 18O values are higher. And the good thing would be if the delta 18O that we measure in the tree rings could represent this delta 18O of the precipitation, so we could assess the precipitation using the tree rings. And while we tested this in the city of São Paulo, we used the extreme drought of 2013 and 14. It was a summer drought. You can see here the precipitation during the summer was very low and was followed by a long dry season that resulted in a massive water shortage in the city. And we sampled some trees in the city of São Paulo, and we tried to see if the trees were actually capturing the delta 18O or the volume of the precipitation. And instead of really using the whole ring to analyze the oxygen isotope, actually we divide the ring in 10 parts, so we would have an information at high resolution intra-annual variation of the precipitation. And we can see here the average delta 18O of each one of these three rings, and we can see that they match really well the precipitation volume in the city. We can see here a year with a lot of precipitation and the values of the delta 18O, and we can see here the drought of 2013 and 14. So because we have this strong association between the delta 18O and the volume of precipitation, we try to associate the delta 18O of the tree with the level of the water reservoirs, and we got a very strong signal. So instead of, despite what Hans Schwangruber said, I can say, at least for the Itipuanas in São Paulo, we can get a very strong climate signal in the trees. So now, seeing another example of environmental pollution, I think environmental pollution is one of the main applications of dendrochronology in the city, because we usually don't have long air quality stations, long air quality records in the city. And what we usually measure in the trees are the metals. So this is the distribution of the number of studies that use each one of these elements in this systematic review. And we can see that lead, copper, zinc are probably the most analyzed elements in the tree rings. And lead is very important because we used to use leaded fuel in the past. And also copper, zinc, cadmium, they are usually associated with the wear of the engine, of the tires, or the brakes of the cars. That's why we analyze them in the trimmings. But of course, there is a very important issue regarding dendrochemistry, and that's the radial migration of the chemical elements. So ideally, if we measure one chemical element in a single ring, it should represent exactly the conditions of the environment when that ring was produced. But that's not really the case, because there is this radial migration of these chemical elements. And this radial migration usually occurs through the wood rays that are these really thin white lines here. These are living cells, and they transport these chemical elements from the outermost part of the wood to the center of the tree, and it mixes a lot the signal that we may get from it. So we decided to try to improve this technique because although, well, the wood rays, they are living cells, but the vessels and the fibers are not. So maybe if we could try to separate the signals from the different cells, we could try to improve the signature in the trimmings. So for that, we use laser ablation coupled to the ICP-MS. The laser beam is really small, it's like 50 micrometers, so we can get the concentrations almost at cell level. And we try in these studies to separate the signal that comes from the vessels, the ones that comes from the fibers, and those that comes from the parenchyma. And here, just to have so you can have an idea of how these elements they are distributed across the wood, we made several tracks with the laser, and then we reconstruct the image. And you can see here for sodium, for instance, you can see that sodium is usually associated with parenchyma bands. You can see here these aliform parenchyma bands. They are well represented in the image, while the other ones, they are mainly associated with the vessels, especially the wider vessels. So we tried by using statistics, we tried to separate these signatures. And we applied this in the city of São Paulo to try to show the environmental inequality that we have in the city. So we had a sampling site in the central part of the city, that's the wealth part of the city. And then we sampled in this part here, that is sort of an industrial district, but with a lot of houses, a lot of people lives there, much more vulnerable district. Here you can see the central part of São Paulo, and here this industrial cluster that's mainly oil refinery and fertilizer companies and so on. And we analyzed, oh, that's very important. We did this study because some people from the medical school, they found out a cluster in autoimmune thyroid and also primary hypothyroidism. So some problems with the thyroids, and they wanted to know what was going on there and if it was associated or not with the oil refinery. So we analyzed all the chemical elements in both sites, and also we have an additional study that also analyzed the Tijuana in the city, in the central part of the city, and where we can see for sure that for all elements in the central part of the city, we see a decrease in trend, and that's sort of expected because we saw a deindustrialization of the central part of the city, and also an increase in the efficiency of the cars. And especially we see a strong decrease in the concentration of lead in the wood, and that's associated with the phase out of lead in the beginning of the 80s. But when we look at this industrial district, what we see is that for most elements, we don't see any change in the concentration. So the concentration kept high all the way through the decades. Lead decreased because the main source was the lead fuel, but we can see that actually vanadium is increasing close to this industrial cluster, and vanadium is usually associated with the activity of oil refineries. So we can see here that for although the people from the central part of São Paulo benefited from the industrialization and also the increasing efficiency of the cars, people from this area that's a more vulnerable neighborhood, they are still facing a lot of high concentrations of air pollution. And now let's see some examples of tree management also in the city. Well, because we sampled these trees around the oil refinery, we want to know not only how air pollution would affect the health of people, but also we wanted to know how air pollution would affect the health of these trees. So these are all the Tijuanas we sampled around this oil refinery, and we measured the tree rings and we estimated the growth rate of these trees. And we can see here clearly this is the plume of the PM10 distribution around this oil refinery. We can see that the trees that are closest to the oil refinery, they grow up to 30% less than trees outside the area of influence of this oil refinery. And that was, I think, one of the first that showed this kind of influence from air pollution, the growth of trees. When we look at the climate signal in these trees, these are the correlations. In red, we show the correlations with temperature, and in blue, the correlations with precipitation. And we can see that the growth of the trees are mainly driven by the variability in temperature. They have a positive correlation with temperature in the site. And when we analyze the effect of particulate matter and ozone, we can see also that there is a very strong negative effect of particulate matter in the growth of these trees. And when we put them together in the analysis, it's very interesting to see that particulate matter has a way stronger effect in the growth of the trees than the climate itself. And this is very important because we know that climate is probably the main driver of growth variability across the world. But when we are in the city, close to a very large source of air pollution, things may change and air pollution may become more important. And also regarding tree management, well, I think, well, when we have such problems with drought that like the one you are having now, it's not only the water supply that we must be aware of, but how these drought could affect the growth of the trees. Because if they affect the growth of the trees, it will also affect the ecosystem services the trees can provide. So we analyzed how the drought of 2013 and 14 affected the growth of Tijuana in the city of São Paulo. And for that, we analyzed delta C13, the carbon isotopes, because we can get some estimates of the physiology and how the trees reacted to the drought in terms of like photosynthesis and stomachoconductance. And so for that, we sampled trees in the park and in the streets. It's pretty much clear that, for instance, trees growing in the streets, they face warmer conditions than trees growing in the park because of heat islands and so on. And we analyze again the delta C13 in terms of intra-annual variability, so how it changed throughout the growing season. But in this study, in the end, although we divide the tree rings in 10 parts, we decided to group these 10 parts in only 3 categories: the beginning, middle, and end, because we were getting a lot of transition results. Like we got a lot of transition results from position 1 to 5, from the beginning to the middle, and then a lot of transition results from the middle to the end. So we decided to put all them together to make it easier to understand. And here we can see the variability in delta C13 in the park and in the street during the drought and the previous and the following year. And you can see 2 things that I think that are quite clear from this graph is that trees growing in the streets, they have a higher delta C13 value, and the trees growing in the park, lower ones, and both trees growing in the street and park in the street, both increase the values of delta C13 during the drought. We use decision tree to actually a regression tree to analyze this data to know what is really driving this change in delta C13. And we see that the main effect comes from the site. So it's really what really drives the delta C13 in the tree rings of these trees is really either if the trees are growing in the park, at this part of the graph, or if they are growing in the streets, that the other part of the graph. And not only that, we can see that climate conditions, if it was a wet year or if it was a dry year, also influence a lot the variability in delta C13. And using the models, that's a sort of preliminary result, we estimated that the trees growing in the streets, they have more or less 30% less GS, 30% stomatoconductance, 30% less assimilation, more or less 50% less mesophyll conductance. So these trees, they are somehow adapting their physiology to be able to live in the streets compared to those growing in the park. And when we compare the dry years and the wet years, for both sides, we estimated a reduction in 15% in stomatoconductance really be able to face the drought. And what's really interesting about the Tijuana is that although it changed the physiology a bit to support the drought, when we look at the tree rings, we can see that there is no change in the growth rate. So this is a resistant tree for drought in the city. And you have many of these here. So I think this, in terms of decision making, this is a very important result. So just to finish and talk about the future of dendrochronology or how I see it, well, I would like to present you this international consortium on nature-based solutions, that's CONNEXUS. And I think that's how dendrochronology can really support this kind of broader projects and projects that involve also people, not only the hard science, but also the part of the soft science. So CONNEXUS is an international consortium on nature-based solution. It's led by the University of Sheffield, but there are like 100 people working from the university, government, and NGOs in this whole project. And in the project, we have pilots of nature-based solutions in 7 cities, 4 here in South America and 3 here in Europe. So it would be São Paulo, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Bogota, Lisbon, Barcelona, and Turin. And each one of these cities, they what we call life labs, they propose different interventions of nature-based solutions. For instance, here in Barcelona, it's mainly urban allotments and how it can be used as air filtering. So it's a relationship between air pollution and urban allotments. For us in São Paulo, it's mainly ecosystem service of urban forests. So this is our life lab. It's called Functional Forest. Involves the University of São Paulo, the Institute for Environmental Research. We are working with the municipality of São Paulo, and also we have an NGO helping us for the engagement of the research with the people. And what we are doing in São Paulo, we are measuring the fluxes between the forest or the urban forest and the atmospheres using edge covariance towers. This one is an edge covariance tower in this park. This is a 500 hectares Atlantic rainforest in the middle of the city. So this is the tower that we are using with the edge covariance. This is a public park. It's a 150 hectares. And here is our system, the edge flux. And also we're measuring the fluxes of CO2, water, and energy. And the idea is really to translate these fluxes in ecosystem services. And this is a third park that we are planning now to install a third tower, probably on this spot. And this is a very interesting park because it's 1,500 hectares. It's a massive park. And it's a nice combination between green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. You can see here the Tietê River crossing the park. There are many lakes, and this is a sort of a floodplain. So we have this mixture between water and vegetation, and we want to know how it affects the fluxes. And we are measuring the same fluxes at the tree level. So we are measuring the growth rate of these trees using dendrometers. We are also assessing how these trees are storing carbon in terms of reserves, non-structural carbohydrates. So we're measuring starch and soluble sugars. We're also measuring the sap flow. So we can connect to the flow of water from the trees with the flow that we're measuring in the flux tower. And so far, we are measuring 53 variables in these parks. So we can really sort of translate the basic science, the biology of these trees in terms of ecosystem service. And the idea is really to know how the forest structure and the forest composition can be changed so we can promote more ecosystem services in the city. And because of CONNEXUS too, that's one of the reasons I'm here today. So because we have all this network of collaborators, we started to plan a global analysis on urban tree research. And our focus is the Tijuana, the tree there, and we're trying to sample Tijuana in different cities. This is the distribution of Tijuana in the world. So we have some Tijuanas already from Buenos Aires. We're going to sample in São Paulo. We have a collaborator that will sample also in Lima. We sample in Lisbon, also here in Barcelona. We'll try in the US. We need some collaborators in Africa and India too. And we are now trying to plan to get some trees from Australia. And the idea is really to know how these trees perform under different environmental conditions and also demographic characteristics of the city. And I would like to take this opportunity really to thank all the group that supported us in the field. It was an amazing week. We had crazy experience during the sampling. If the cops came to ask what we were doing, they were interested in the research, of course. And well, overall, as a conclusion, I would say that Turings are really a key tool for decision making, evidence-based decision making. I think it's pretty much clear by now. I think that Turings must be used with other approach. It could be ecophysiology and can be also to support soft science and how we can engage the population to understand the importance of the trees in the city. It's a question now, it's really Tijuana maybe a rising star in terms of urban dendrochronology, and let's go global, let's try to make it a global study. And again, so I hope you share my my vision that's really for dendrochronology, the sky's the limit, and thank you.